Donald Trump called it patriotism, but the evidence screams betrayal. 1,242 indictments, 312 prison sentences, and a secret memo marked Day 1. In front of the Constitution itself, Jasmine Crockett hurls accusations that cut like knives, calling Trump a coward, a liar, and the disease of democracy. The chamber erupts as shocking documents and hidden voices surface, exposing a plot buried in invisible ink. Will America finally see the mask ripped off, or will power dare the truth again? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The storm had been building all day, but it wasn't outside. It was inside the U.S. Capitol, in a hearing chamber converted into a battlefield of truth. Cameras swept across rows of faces, veterans with rigid spines, Capitol Police survivors with scars, both seen and hidden, single mothers gripping photographs of loved ones lost. The hum of live broadcast equipment crackled like static before lightning. Millions of Americans were watching, waiting for a confrontation that promised not speeches but shockwaves. At the far end sat Donald Trump, surrounded by loyalists, arms folded, a grin painted across his face like a dare. His eyes flickered with defiance, the look of a man convinced he was untouchable. Beside him, Jim Jordan leaned forward, tapping his pen against the desk, ready to pounce on every word. The air was thick, not with ceremony but with tension, every breath in the room chained to the expectation of collision. Then the doors opened, and Jasmine Crockett strode in. No hesitation, no glance to the cameras, no wasted gestures. Her entrance cut through the air like a blade. She didn't head straight to the podium. Instead, she stopped at the witness table stacked with evidence, folders bulging with indictments, photographs of chaos, names etched in black ink. She laid her hand flat on the pile, a silent claim, "This is mine to unleash." The audience shifted, leaning forward as if gravity itself pulled them toward her. A Capitol officer in uniform whispered to a colleague, "She's not here to speak, she's here to strike." Jasmine's voice broke the silence with surgical precision. "Tonight, we're not here to argue policy. We're here to decide if this nation still belongs to its people or to a man who believes he's above every law ever written." Her words landed like gunfire. The crowd gasped, a veteran's fist clenched, and even the cameras seemed to tighten focus. Trump smirked wider, but there was a flicker, a twitch at the edge of his jaw, the smallest sign that her opening blow had found its mark. She lifted a single sheet of paper, holding it to the light. 1,242 indictments, she declared. 312 prison sentences, hundreds of guilty pleas. And yet, the man before you, she gestured sharply toward Trump, still dares to call it patriotism. Murmurs ripped through the chamber. A mother in the front row clutched her child's picture tighter, eyes wet with rage. The weight of numbers wasn't abstract anymore, it was flesh, blood, and heartbreak sitting in that room. Jasmine leaned in, voice lowering, each word sharpened for the jugular. "You incited violence, you pardoned traitors. You rewarded those who tried to tear down this Capitol brick by brick. And now, you think history can be rewritten under these lights." Her hand slammed the table once, jolting the microphones into feedback that screamed across. Trump shifted, his grin spreading wider. But the grin wasn't joy, it was provocation. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping disdain. "Cheap theater from a failed actress." The words cracked through the room, ugly, arrogant, soaked with contempt. Gasps swept the chamber, followed by scattered murmurs of disbelief. Some shook their heads, others stiffened in anger. And the Capitol officer from earlier muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable." Trump smirked again, savoring the reaction, as though he had thrown gasoline into a fire and dared someone to strike a match. Jasmine did not flinch. She leaned forward, her eyes blazing, and her reply came with the weight of thunder. "No, this is not theater." She paused, her gaze locking on Trump like a laser. "This is the courtroom of history." Her voice deepened, resonant enough to echo off marble and brass. "And history is merciless." The silence afterward was suffocating, the kind of silence where a single cough would sound like betrayal. The cameras shifted angles, panning to the faces in the audience. Veterans standing straighter, police survivors blinking back memories of barricades and blood. Ordinary families who had come to witness other truth still had a voice in America. For a moment, it seemed hope flickered again, rising on Jasmine's defiance, an ember catching against a storm. But then Trump chuckled low, the kind of laugh that carried no humor, only menace. His arrogance reasserted itself like a tide swallowing sand. Doubt crept back into the room. Could one woman, no matter how fierce, force accountability from a system where power often rewrote its own rules? The narrator's voice slid into the tension, not soothing but sharp, pulling the audience outside the chamber for a heartbeat. Do you think justice is still possible in a system stacked with power? Or is courage destined to break itself against walls built by the powerful? The question hovered like smoke, seeping into every corner of the broadcast, daring viewers to answer in the comments, daring them to take a side. Jasmine's hand curled into a fist on the table, knuckles white against the wood. Her jaw was set, her eyes unwavering, her silence louder than Trump's insult. In that moment, she wasn't just a congresswoman, she was the embodiment of a promise made to every citizen watching, that truth would not kneel, even when mocked, even when outnumbered. The crowd exhaled as if they had been holding their breath, and the chamber trembled not with applause, but with anticipation. The clash had only just begun, and already the stakes were no longer about politics, but survival. The final words from Jasmine, low and deliberate, drove the point like a knife. Let the record show, tonight the mask begins to crack. Jasmine's words still hung in the air when a chair scraped forward and Jared Moskowitz stepped into the light. Unlike the polished theater of Trump's entourage, Jared looked deliberate, sleeves rolled once, folders clutched tight. His reputation was that of a man who traded comfort for candor, and tonight his role was clear: to reinforce Jasmine's strike with the weight of documented truth. He spoke not with volume but with precision, each syllable sharp as a scalpel. We have the files, we have the logs, we have the voices that can no longer be ignored. The audience murmured, and cameras locked on his face, as though to record a moment when another soldier joined the battlefield. From the second row, a different kind of presence rose. Officer Adams. His limp was small but undeniable, a reminder of the day his shield was dented, his ribs fractured, his faith in leadership broken. He placed a battered helmet on the table in front of him, dented and scarred like an artifact pulled from the ruins of democracy. "This was my armor," he said, voice trembling, "but on January 6th, it wasn't enough. I heard them scream his name as they struck us down." He didn't need to point to Trump. The silence that followed did it for him. Viewers at home felt the weight, the image of that helmet burning itself into memory. A silent accusation more powerful than any speech. Then came Mrs. Rivera. She carried no files, no props, only a framed photograph pressed against her chest, a young man in a graduation gown, eyes alive with possibility. She didn't sit, she stood at the edge of the witness table, hands trembling, voice soft but steady enough to pierce the room. "My son believed this nation could be better. He marched for justice, not destruction. The wall he tried to protect, he was trampled in the chaos unleashed that day." Her gaze snapped to Trump, and the entire chamber seemed to lean in. "You called his killers patriots, you called their violence love. What kind of leader glorifies blood spilled on his own doorstep?" Gasps tore through the audience. Trump shifted uneasily, his grin faltering for the first time, and the cameras captured the crack like a predator catching the scent of weakness. Jasmine took it all in, the ally with evidence, the officer with scars, the mother with grief, and placed her hand over the files before her. Her tone sharpened into command. "These are not props, these are lives. And for every life broken, there is a lie waiting to be unmasked." She swept the room with her gaze, from Trump to Jordan, to the witnesses, to the millions watching. Beyond the cameras, her voice dropped lower, not to whisper but to strike harder. "We will tear away the camouflage, we will expose what was hidden in plain sight. And when the mask falls, there will be no escape from what stares back." The light seemed to dim, the silence seemed to deepen, as if the room itself braced for impact. The broadcast froze on Jasmine's glare, the audience caught between fear and anticipation, and in that charged stillness, one question thundered louder than applause, louder than protest, louder than lies. What hidden evidence will rip through the silence and bring? Trump leaned forward, his voice slashing through the chamber like broken glass. "You're nothing but a political prostitute for the media." The words landed with the weight of a grenade. Gasps erupted from the crowd, veterans' jaws tightening, mothers clutching photos tighter, reporters' pens stalling mid-scratch. The insult didn't just smear Jasmine, it smeared everyone who believed in accountability, and for a moment the rotunda trembled on the edge of chaos. Trump reclined back in his chair, satisfy, his smirk widening as if he had just carved his name into the walls of history. Jasmine froze, not from shock but from calculation. The camera zoomed close, capturing the flicker of hurt in her eyes before it hardened into resolve. She steadied her breath, her hand pressing firmly onto the stack of files in front of her, anchoring herself to the evidence she carried. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her head and locked eyes with Trump. The silence stretched, unbearable, until she finally spoke, each word laced with fire. "I am not a prostitute," she said, her voice resonating like steel striking steel. "I am a lawyer for the Constitution. You," she jabbed a finger in his direction, "are nothing more than a hustler of chaos, selling fear like it's merchandise." The chamber erupted, not in applause, not in protest, but in raw electricity. Viewers could feel the clash spilling out of their screens, washing into living rooms, bars, and smartphones across the nation. Veterans nodded, officers clenched fists, and families leaned forward with wide eyes. Trump's grin faltered for a fraction of a second, then returned, tighter, angrier. Jim Jordan shifted in his seat, lips curled as if preparing to leap into the fray, but Jasmine's voice cut him off before he could move. "Do not mistake volume for power, Mr. Trump. You may shout." The chamber had barely recovered from Jasmine's fiery retort when Jim Jordan lunged into the microphone, his voice pitched to a near scream. "Point of order. Point of order. This is nothing but partisan slander." He waved his arms like a conductor trying to drown out an orchestra, his words tumbling into one another as if volume could erase fact. The gavel hammered once, twice, but Jordan pressed on, desperate to cut Jasmine off before her words could carve deeper. The crowd groaned, the tension doubling, the spectacle teetering between debate and riot. Jasmine didn't blink. She leaned forward, spine straight as a blade, and sliced through his nose with a voice that did not need to be raised. "I will not let the gavel silence the truth." The words rang with such finality that even the gavel paused, suspended midair. The chamber stilled, the cameras zoomed, and for the first time that night it was clear. Jasmine was not fighting for airtime. She was fighting for oxygen itself, refusing to let lies suffocate the nation. Jared Moskowitz chose that moment to rise, his hand steady on the evidence folder. He pressed a button, and the screens flanking the chamber flickered alive. A cascade of digital light formed into a map. Cell site heat data from January 6th. Bright red pulses bloomed across the Capitol grounds, spreading like a virus, showing how rioters moved in coordinated waves, converging with chilling precision. Gasps erupted from the audience. Veterans leaned forward. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even the survivors of that day felt the room tilt back toward the chaos they remembered all too vividly. Trump's eyes narrowed. He leaned toward his mic, dripping disdain. "Fake maps, that's all this is. Fancy graphics for television, nothing more." His laugh was hollow, a brittle sound that betrayed unease. Jim Jordan nodded eagerly beside him, pounding the desk as though nose could replace proof, but Jasmine struck back with scalpel precision. She tapped the screen once, and a new marker appeared, sharp, undeniable, glowing like a flare in the dark. "Then explain," she said, voice slow, deliberate, merciless, "why your phone pinged here." Her finger pressed the point again, and the room seemed to explode. The marker pulsed at the exact entrance of the Capitol, time-stamped to the hour chaos erupted. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavier than any shouting. Trump froze, his smirk faltering, the cameras catching every twitch of discomfort. The audience erupted in whispers, some stunned, some enraged. Officer Adams rose slowly from his chair, the room quieting as though the air itself knew what was coming. He didn't bring papers or screens, he brought his body as evidence. With a deliberate motion, he rolled up his sleeve, exposing a jagged scar running across his forearm, pale against the harsh chamber lights. The camera zoomed in, every television in America catching the tremor in his hand as he steadied his arm. His voice cracked, not from weakness but from memory. "They shouted your name, Mr. Trump, as they swung flagpoles at my head, as they crushed us against the doors. They shouted your name." The words ricocheted around the chamber like bullets, undeniable, unforgettable. Trump leaned back, lips curling into a sneer, the smirk of a man who mistook cruelty for power. "A failed cop chasing fame," he spat, the insult laced with venom. The audience erupted in gasps and mutters of outrage. Veterans in the back row bristled, fists tightening. Mothers in the gallery shook their heads in disbelief, The scar on Adams's arm glistened with sweat under the lights, Orion living rebuttal to Trump's mockery. For a moment, you could hear the sound of Adams's breathing ragged, deliberate like a soldier back on the line of fire. Jasmine Crockett shot to her feet, fury blazing in her eyes, her voice cutting through the chamber like a blade. You insult the people who bled for this nation. You insult every officer who stood between us and anarchy. You. She pointed straight at Trump, her words like thunderclaps, are the coward here. The chamber shook with applause, gasps, and even shouts of agreement. Survivors of January 6th, seated in the front row, wiped tears from their eyes. Adams lowered his arm, but his testimony lingered in the scar, in the silence, in the shame now hovering over Trump's table. Trump opened his mouth again, but the sound died before it left his lips. He looked sideways, his loyalists frozen, unsure whether to defend him or stay silent. The cameras caught the falter, the momentary collapse of bravado. Jasmine didn't let the silence go to waste. She leaned into the microphone, her voice steady, unyielding. Men like Adams fought with their bodies. Families like Mrs. Rivera sacrificed with their blood. And what did you give, Mr. Trump? Lies, excuses, mockery. The audience broke into applause again, but Jasmine raised her hand, silencing them. Her next words landed with the precision of a hammer striking steel. This chamber will remember scars. This chamber will remember names, and history will remember the coward who tried to laugh them away. The camera panned to Adams, his scar now framed like a wound engraved into the republic itself. The narrator's voice slid into the moment. The chamber went dark without warning, and the sudden shift pulled a gasp from the crowd. For a heartbeat, only the faint hum of equipment and the shuffling of uneasy feet filled the silence. Then, with a low mechanical whir, ultraviolet projectors flickered to life. The glass display at the center of the room, the one holding files believed to be mundane government logs, suddenly glowed with ghostly blue light. Words appeared like scars emerging under the skin. D-Day, clear January 6 cases, prioritize, core group, day 1. The letters pulsed, raw and undeniable, as though history itself had been branded into the room. Gasps erupted in waves, spreading from the front rows to the back like a chain reaction. Veterans stood half out of their seats, jaws tight, while mothers in the gallery clutched their children's photos to their chests. Reporters scrambled, pens racing across notepads, the click of cameras firing like gunshots. The entire hall buzzed with shock, disbelief, and a rising fury. It was more than evidence, it was a confession etched in ink meant to vanish. Dragged back into the light, Trump leaned back, his smirk curdling into disdain. He forced out a scoff, his voice dripping with condescension. Stage tricks, cheap parlor magic for the gullible. He chuckled, shaking his head, but the laugh rang hollow, clattering against the marble like a dropped coin. Jim Jordan nodded quickly, clapping once as if to rally applause, but the audience wasn't with him. The weight of the glowing words drowned out their denial. Jasmine stepped closer to the display, the ultraviolet glow painting her face in shades of fire and shadow. Her voice dropped, cold and deliberate. Stage tricks don't match metadata, Mr. Trump. She raised a finger, pointing toward the words that refused to disappear. These words carry timestamps, login IDs, and fingerprints buried in the system. Every keystroke is archived, every command has an author. Do you want me to read the name attached to Eagle for aloud right now? The chamber erupted again, half the audience gasping, the other half murmuring in disbelief. Trump's smirk twitched, just enough for the cameras to catch the fracture. Officer Adams shifted forward, his scarred arm resting on the table like proof incarnate. Mrs. Rivera clutched her son's framed photograph tighter, whispering a prayer through clenched teeth. Jared Moskowitz leaned into the mic. This isn't theater. This is the skeleton of a cover-up dragged into daylight. The crowd stirred, some rising from their seats, as though the walls themselves couldn't hold the weight of what was unfolding. The glow on the glass flickered once, then steadied, burning the words deeper into the nation's eyes. The silence that followed was sharper than any outcry. A silence where everyone knew history had just shifted. And into that silence, the narrator's voice cut like a blade, whispering the question that clenched the stomach of every viewer at home. What would you do if history's darkest secrets were written in vanishing ink? And suddenly, they refused to disappear. Jared adjusted his glasses, the chamber still glowing faintly from the ultraviolet reveal. With steady hands, he tapped the console before him and brought a new file onto the towering screens. Rows of code and metadata burst into view. sterile yet damning in their precision. He highlighted one lie, his voice carrying the calm of a surgeon about to cut deep. Timestamp: 9:12 a.m. White House Internal Network. User tag: EAGL. The crowd reacted in waves, first with silence, then with a sharp intake of collective breath. Reporters lurched forward, snapping photos of the glowing screen, while veterans muttered under their breath, trying to piece together what they had just heard. Mothers clutched the photos of their children, whispering prayers they had whispered before. Even officers hardened by trauma shifted in their seats, staring at the screen as if it were a mirror reflecting betrayal. The chamber pulsed, between shock and disbelief, the tension heavy enough to bow the marble. Trump jolted forward, slamming his palm on the desk. Fabricated, he bellowed, spit flying as the word cracked across the rotunda. His face flushed crimson, his grin twisted into a snarl. Fake metadata. You think people are stupid enough to believe your doctored files? He gestured wildly at Jared. This is a hoax, a fraud, a witch hunt cooked up by losers desperate for airtime. His voice grew louder, shriller, until the gavel cracked down to rein him in. But the cameras had caught it all, the panic edging through his anger, the defensive fury betraying something more than indignation. The audience fractured, voices rising into a chaotic chorus. Some shouted, "Lies," while others hissed, "He's cornered." A veteran barked out, "Metadata doesn't lie." While a loyalist countered with, "It's all stage." The chamber quaked with suspicion, the line between belief and denial now razor thin. The tension was no longer about politics, it was about perception, about who the nation would trust, cold data on a glowing screen, or the raw power of Trump's bluster. Jasmine leaned into the microphone, her gaze drilling into Trump. Metadata doesn't care about your excuses. It doesn't bend under your insults. It only answers one question: who pressed the keys? Her words sliced into the nose, and the room fell still again. On the screen, the line user, EAGLE for pulsed like a heartbeat. Every eye in the chamber followed that single identifier, as if it were a cipher waiting to be broken. Jared's voice dropped, quieter but heavier than before. This tag isn't random. It's tied to clearance, tied to intent, and tied to someone in this room. The silence that followed was suffocating, a silence that dared someone to break it. The crowd leaned forward, every heartbeat sensing with the pulsing glow of that code. And then no one moved. The audience held their breath as her words sank deeper, pressing on every chest in the hall. A veteran wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. A police officer shifted uncomfortably, lips pressed tight, as though holding back a sob. Even the reporters, trained to record without reaction, lowered their pens for a moment, overcome. Mrs. Rivera's voice quivered again, but she forced the words out, each syllable laced with the weight of grief. He was not a statistic, he was not a pawn, he was my child. And you erased him with a single sentence. Trump leaned into his microphone, his voice colder than stone. I don't take responsibility for her feelings. The cruelty in the words reverberated across the chamber like shrapnel. Gasps broke out, some angry, some anguished, as if the entire hall had been slapped at once. Mrs. Rivera's shoulders crumpled for a moment, but her grip on the photograph tightened, holding her son's smile against the ugliness of that dismissal. The cruelty was so stark, so brazen, that the silence afterward felt heavier than any nose could have been. Jasmine Crockett stood so suddenly her chair screeched against the floor. Her voice erupted, thunder cracking through the suffocating air. That, she pointed straight at Trump, her eyes blazing, is the voice of tyranny, not leadership. The chamber erupted, half the crowd rising to their feet, others gasping at the sheer force of her rage. She didn't stop. Her voice carried like a storm, her words aimed not only at Trump but at the millions watching. Leaders carry the grief of their people. Cowards spit on it. Leaders protect. Tyrants mock. And tonight, this room sees the difference. Trump shifted in his seat, his smirk gone, his eyes flickering between fury and discomfort. Jordan tried to lean into his microphone, but Jasmine cut him off with nothing more than a raised hand, commanding the silence back into her grip. Every scar, every tear, every mother who buried a child is proof of what you unleashed, she said, her voice steady now, no less fierce. And when history remembers this night, it will not remember your excuses, it will remember the cruelty you chose when compassion was your only chance to be human. The room was no longer divided, even those who had doubted sat frozen, stunned by the clarity of the moment. The photograph in Mrs. Rivera's hand seemed to glow under the chamber lights, more powerful than any evidence file, more damning than any statistic, and as the silence returned, charged with anger and grief, the narrator's voice cut through, carrying the weight of the question that demanded an answer from every viewer. Can empathy break through arrogance, or will cruelty reign unchallenged? The lights in the chamber dimmed again, but this time not for spectacle. A low hum filled the speakers, and then a distorted voice crackled to life, warped and grainy like a signal smuggled out of a war zone. The room stilled instantly, every ear straining to catch the words. We were told, prepare 19 names for clemency. File code. Janus. The syllables were jagged, unnatural, but the meaning was unmistakable. A bomb had just been dropped in the middle of the nation's most sacred hall. Gasps erupted in waves, some sharp, some guttural, like the air had been knocked from the lungs of the chamber. Reporters fumbled to capture the moment, their pens scratching furiously. Survivors stiffened, exchanging horrified glances, and even hardened veterans muttered curses under their breath. The phrase 19 names ricocheted across the audience, whispered in disbelief, as if repeating it might strip it of its nightmare weight. Janus, a word meant to stay buried, now seared into memory. Trump reacted instantly, his fist slamming onto the table so hard the microphones popped with static. Lies, absolute lies, he thundered, spit flying, face twisted into a mask of fury. Anyone can fake a voice. This is nothing but a cheap trick, a shadow play for the cameras. His knuckles whitened against the wood, and his loyalists tried to nod, to echo his anger, but their voices drowned beneath the rising buzz of the crowd. Doubt had been seeded, but so had belief, and the tension between the two threatened to crack the room apart. Jasmine rose, her composure like iron, her presence cutting through Trump's chaos. She raised a single hand, and the noise quieted, as if the chamber itself obeyed her command. Mr. Trump, she said evenly, eyes locked on him, you can scoff all you like, but shadows leave fingerprints too. She turned to Jared, who tapped a key. On the massive screens, waveforms bloomed in vivid color, layered and analyzed. Numbers scrolled across the bottom, sterile, clinical, but devastating. Jasmine's voice carried the final blow. Voice print analysis, 98.7% match. The audience exploded not with chaos, but with sound that was half gasp, half roar, as the implication settled like a storm cloud. The graphics on screen, the jagged waves pulsing against a digital baseline, were no longer just data. They were a ghost come back to testify. A mother clutched her chest, a police survivor whispered God under his breath, and even skeptics shifted in their seats, their eyes betraying cracks in their certainty. Trump sat back, red-faced and rigid, trying to summon another denial, but the moment had slipped out of his grasp. For the first time that night, his bluster didn't dominate the room. The chamber belonged to the evidence, to the voice from the shadows that refused to be silenced. The narrator's voice slipped into the stunned silence, low and chilling, speaking directly to every viewer leaning toward their screens at home. Would you trust a voice from the shadows, especially when it sounds this close to the truth? The screens flicker, then split in two. On the left, the distorted voice of Cedar continued, its edges sharpened by fear. We were told, prepare 19 names for clemency. On the right, visitor logs from the White House lit up like a confession, columns of names, dates, and times that aligned with Cedar's words down to the minute. The chamber froze as the entries scrolled in sequence. January 5th, January 6th, January 7th, staffers who had sworn secrecy, advisors who had vanished from public sight, and beside them, a code tied to the shadow identity EAGLE4. The alignment was perfect. Testimony and logs moved like two halves of the same blade, meeting in a sharpened point. The crowd reacted in ripples, some gasping, others whispering with trembling voices. Reporters leaned forward, capturing every detail as though afraid the evidence would vanish if they blinked. A mother in the gallery covered her mouth, while a Capitol officer whispered a prayer under his breath. Tension clawed at the chamber walls until it felt too small to contain what was happening. Trump's face twisted, his chair squealing as he shot upright. His voice erupted, a blast of fury meant to drown the storm. This is persecution, he bellowed, slamming a fist on the table hard enough to rattle his water glass. A political lynching, a hoax cooked up by traitors to smear me in front of the nation. His words poured out in rage, desperate to reclaim the narrative, but Jasmine cut him down with a single line. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. Her tone was sharper than steel. "No. This is cross-examination," she gestured to the screens, her finger slicing across the air. "The words and the logs, the witness and the wrecker. One voice from the shadows, one ledger carved in daylight. They speak the same story," the crowd murmured. Louder now, less disbelief, and more grim acknowledgement. For the first time, Trump's shouting didn't consume the oxygen, it only underlined the weight of what he could not erase. The split screen glowed on, relentless, daring the world to look away. On social feeds across America, clips of Cedars, words sensed with the visitor logs exploded, hashtags spiking into trending columns within minutes. The chamber itself felt like it was vibrating, caught between fear of what this meant and the courage it would take to face it. A Capitol survivor in the front row whispered, "He's cornered." And for a heartbeat, even Trump's allies seemed to falter, eyes darting toward the screen, as though it held a mirror to their complicity. The narrator's voice seeped into the silence, intimate, unflinching, addressing not just the room but every viewer at home. "If you were Cedar, would you testify against your own boss? Would you risk reputation, safety, even your life to bring the truth into daylight?" The split screen continued to glow, relentless, a digital guillotine waiting to fall. And as the weight of Cedar's testimony pressed harder, the question clawed at every soul watching: will Cedar's words bring the house down or vanish into whispers swallowed by power? Trump's voice ripped through the chamber like a thunderclap, his fist slamming the desk for punctuation. "Look at your inflation, your failed leadership. You want to lecture me about democracy while Americans can't afford food, while shelves are bare, while families bury children because your government can't keep them safe." His words shot like bullets, ricocheting off marble walls, designed not to prove but to provoke. Loyalists in the back row nodded furiously, clapping and chanting as though volume could bury evidence. For a moment, the tide seemed to shift, anger surging like a wave, the crowd restless, teetering between fury and disbelief. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't rise to his theatrics. Instead, she reached for a folder marked House Oversight Report and snapped it open with a sound sharper than the gavel. Her voice came out cold, precise, the tone of a prosecutor entering exhibits into the record. "Grocery prices have not risen with inflation, Mr. Trump, they've doubled it. Eggs, milk, bread, staples of the American table are climbing at twice the rate you promised to cut. Medicine shortages aren't headlines, they are funerals waiting to happen. In the past year alone, 100 children, yes, 100 children died preventable deaths while your administration boasted about distractions." Her words didn't just accuse, they carved. Every syllable was a blade of fact, every statistic a nail in the coffin of his deflection. The chamber shifted again, the energy seizing in shock. Mothers clutched their children tighter. A veteran in uniform shook his head slowly, lips pressed tight with disgust. Even journalists, hardened to spectacle, glanced at one another with raised brows. They knew they were not documenting theater anymore but testimony that would ripple beyond this room. The red-faced fury on Trump's cheeks deepened, but beneath it the cameras caught the twitch in his eyes, the quick flicker of fear disguised as rage. Jasmine leaned closer to the mic, her voice tightening into a wire of resolve. "Do not dare wave the suffering of American families like a shield for your failures. Do not stand behind coffins and call it leadership. You do not own their pain, you exploited it. And tonight, in front of the world, I am calling you what you are, a man who abandoned the living for his own survival." The audience broke into a low rumble, half outrage, half awe. Trump opened his mouth, but no sound came. For the first time, his silence looked less like defiance and more like retreat. Jared raised another chart on the screen, colored lines tracking inflation against grocery staples, and the room hushed again, forced to look. The numbers didn't shout, they didn't sneer. They spoke with brutal clarity, and Jasmine's closing line landed like a hammer shattering glass. "History does not bend to propaganda. It bends to proof." The narrator's voice slipped in, sharp and deliberate, aiming directly at the viewers leaning forward at home. "Do numbers speak louder than propaganda, or will you let the loudest liar drown out the truth?" Trump leaned into the microphone, his voice swelling with the bravado of a man who had rehearsed the line 1,000 times. I saved the American economy. Nobody did it better. Nobody. The stock market was roaring. Jobs were returning. America was winning again until they stole it from me. His words boomed across the chamber, punctuated by sweeping hand gestures, as though he were addressing a rally instead of facing accountability. Loyalists in the audience clapped on cue, their applause sharp but hollow, like firecrackers in a storm. Jasmine didn't wait for the echo of his performance to fade. She snapped open a folder, pulling out charts printed in bold red and black. She rose to her feet, every movement deliberate, and slammed the first chart onto the projector. The screen came alive with a jagged red line climbing like a wound that refused to close. Youth unemployment, 13.4%, she declared, her voice cutting through the chamber like a blade. That is not recovery. That is a generation left stranded. The murmur began immediately, whispers rippling like wind through dry grass, the audience stunned by the sharpness of the statistic. Before the chamber could settle, she flipped to the next chart. Groceries, bread, milk, eggs bars doubled in size, red stacked against blue. Inflation in essentials has doubled, Jasmine said, each syllable heavy with accusation. Families aren't feeling your miracle economy. They're watching their paychecks evaporate every time they walk into a store. The murmurs deepened into groans, the weight of lived experience colliding with hard data. A mother in the gallery shook her head, whispering, "That's my life right now," and others nodded, the truth on the screen matching the truth in their wallets. Then came the final blow. A map of the United States flashed up, 12 states shaded in crimson. Bold letters read, "Public Health Emergency Declarations." Jasmine's voice grew quieter, colder, each word sharpened by restraint. 12 states, 12 communities overwhelmed. By shortages in medicine, by preventable deaths, by crises your administration ignore. While you patted yourself on the back, the chamber shifted, its energy tilting from disbelief to anger. Even those who had clapped minutes earlier now sat stiff, silent, unwilling to meet her gaze. Trump barked a laugh, but the sound rang false, a thin veneer over a tightening jaw. Fake numbers, fake maps, fake crises. The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. The audience sat caught between shock and rage, torn between propaganda and proof. And as the camera panned across their faces, veterans, mothers, students, officers, the narrators' voice slid in, calm but unrelenting. When numbers clash, who do you believe, the man who boasts, or the evidence that bleeds? Trump's face flushed crimson, as the charts behind him glared like evidence carved into stone. He slammed his fist against the desk, his voice cracking into a roar. "You're a snake in lipstick." The insult slithered across the chamber, crude, venomous, meant to humiliate not just Jasmine but every woman watching. Gasps shot through the audience, sharp, indignant, some shocked into silence, others hissing their outrage. The insult hung in the air like smoke from a dirty fire, poisoning the atmosphere with its contempt. Jasmine didn't recoil. She stood, her figure illuminated by the harsh chamber lights, her presence filling the rotunda with something sharper than rage, defiance. She leaned into the microphone, her voice honed to a lethal edge. "I am not a snake. I am the antibody of democracy." The words cracked like thunder, snapping every head in the chamber toward her. She jabbed a finger at Trump, her tone lower now, venom redirected with surgical precision. "And you, Donald Trump, are the disease of lies, the infection eating this republic from the inside." The chamber erupted. Some clapped, some gasped, and others shouted, but no one could deny the electricity pulsing through the room. Trump's grin faltered, then returned, wider but thinner, forced like a mask stretched too tight. He leaned back, in his chair, smirking, but the cameras caught the flicker in his eyes, the twitch at his jaw. Jasmine pressed on, refusing to give him oxygen. Diseases spread in silence, lies spread in shadows, but today under these lights they are exposed. And like every sickness, yours can and will be cured. She slammed her hand against the folder of evidence, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. The audience leaned forward, unable to tear their eyes away. Veterans nodded grimly, survivors of January 6th clenched fists, tears burning at the corners of their eyes. Mothers in the gallery whispered to their children, pointing toward Jasmine with pride, as if to etch the moment into memory. Even the journalists, hardened by years of political theater, scribbled furiously, sensing they were recording a turning point, a line that would echo far beyond the walls of this chamber. Trump tried to laugh, but it was brittle, cracking halfway. "She's grandstanding, she's desperate," he barked, waving his hands, but the words bounced off the chamber's walls without weight. Jasmine's defiance had shifted the air. Her fury had transformed into something immovable, a shield forged from truth. She straightened, her eyes scanning the audience, then piercing straight through the cameras into the millions watching at home. Her voice softened but sharpened all the same. "Tonight, every American must decide. Do you want antibodies or do you want the disease? Do you want democracy or do you want decay?" The silence afterward was deafening, punctured only by the sound of scribbling pens and the faint hum of broadcast equipment. And then the narrator's voice slid in, daring the viewers to respond, demanding they take a side. "Comment one word right now. Do you see Trump as a leader or a liar?" The room had just begun to settle when Mrs. Rivera rose again, her grief now sharpened into something unbreakable. She clutched her son's photograph against her chest, then took a single step toward the witness table, her voice cutting through the chamber like glass shattering in the night. "Apologize," she demanded, her tone trembling with both pain and fury. The word wasn't a plea, it was an order, the cry of a mother standing in for every parent who had lost a child in the chaos that January unleashed. The chamber froze, all eyes shifting from her photograph to Trump, waiting for a crack in the mask. Trump didn't flinch. He didn't soften. He leaned back in his chair, lips curling into a sneer, and fired back with venom that chilled the room. "Weakness has no place here." The words landed like a hammer against bone, brutal in their cruelty. Gasps turned instantly to outrage as the audience erupted in boos, a thunderous rejection that shook the walls. Veterans slammed their palms against the benches, survivors hissed curses under their breath, and even reporters, usually silent witnesses, looked up from their notes in disbelief. The cruelty wasn't just political, it was personal, and it spilled into every corner of the chamber. Mrs. Rivera's hands trembled, but she refused to lower her son's photograph. Tears streaked down her face as she shouted above the noise, "My son's life was not weakness. His sacrifice was not weakness." Her voice cracked, raw, unfiltered, but it pierced deeper than any statistic or legal argument. The audience roared their agreement, and for a moment it felt as though the entire nation was standing behind her, channeling grief into rage. The camera zoomed in on Trump's face, catching the faint twitch in his jaw, a tell that betrayed unease beneath his sneer. Jasmine stepped forward, her fury under perfect control, her voice a weapon honed to precision. "There it is. The man who claims to lead cannot even acknowledge the dead. He spits on sacrifice, dismisses blood spilled for democracy, and calls it weakness. That is not strength, it is cowardice dressed in arrogance." The boos swelled louder, now rhythmic, a chorus of condemnation aimed at Trump. Jared stepped back to the console, his hand hovering for a beat before he pressed the key that would detonate the next revelation. The chamber lights dimmed, and a new screen flickered alive, its surface glowing with sterile digital clarity. A single line appeared: First West Wing access log, 9:17 a.m., user ID, EAGLE4. Then the image followed, grainy but unmistakable. A figure swiping into the Oval Office, arm curled around a crimson folder stamped with the code word Janus. The moment it landed on the screen, the entire hall seemed to gasp in unison. It was not just data, it was a ghost caught on camera. The crowd erupted with disbelief, gasps layered over shouts, the tension breaking into chaos. Reporters lunged forward, cameras zoomed in tight on the glowing image, veterans muttered curses through clenched teeth, while mothers in the gallery whispered prayers as if the photograph itself carried an omen. On the floor, Trump's mask cracked for the first time. His smirk evaporated, his skin paling as though the blood had drained from his face. The reaction was subtle, but devastating, caught instantly by every camera in the chamber. Jasmine rose, her presence electric, her voice sharp as a knife's edge. "There it is," she declared. Not rhetoric, not rumors, not shadows. A log, a time, a code name, and a folder, the Janus file clutched by the hand of the insider who carried out your orders. The audience roared, some in outrage, others in stunned silence, but all transfixed by the red slash of evidence burning across the screen. Trump lurched toward his microphone, his voice breaking into a stammer before he steadied it. "Photoshopped. That's what this is, a fraud." But the weakness in his tone betrayed him. The cameras caught the dart of his eyes, the twitch in his jaw, and the visible clench of his fist. His denial rang hollow, Colliding with the weight of proof no bluster could erase, the chamber quieted again, every eye fixed on the glowing red folder frozen mid-frame. The tension built like pressure in a sealed vault, ready to burst. Even the hum of the broadcast equipment seemed to fade, as the image seared itself into memory. And then Jasmine leaned forward, her words landing like a hammer to the spine of the nation. The question is no longer whether the orders existed. The question is, what's in the red folder? The silence that followed was deafening, a silence thick with dread and anticipation, daring every viewer to stay until the secret was forced into the light. Jasmine didn't waste a second. She stood tall, eyes locked on Trump, her voice ringing out with the certainty of a verdict. Chain of custody, audit seals, camera hash values. Every frame, every log, every byte of this evidence has been verified and cross-verified. Your denials don't stand against no's, they crumble under math. The words hit like sledgehammers, stripping away. The audience stilled, the storm receding into a taut silence. On the screen, lines of code scrolled past, each one stamped with verification checks, each one proof immune to rhetoric. Even those who had doubted shifted uneasily, the weight of data pressing down harder than any speech could. The chaos drained from the room, leaving clarity so sharp it almost hurt to look at. Trump sagged back into his chair, red-faced and sweating, his fists still clenched but trembling now. His denials, once weapons, had become confessions of weakness. The cameras caught every falter, every crack in his facade, and the nation watching felt the tilt of the moment. And then, in the silence heavy as judgment, the narrator's voice slipped in, surgical and unrelenting. At what point do lies collapse under their own weight? And when they do, will the truth be strong enough to rise in their place? The chamber, once tense with whispers and gasps, erupted into a thunderous chant. Justice, justice, justice. The sound rolled like an earthquake through the marble walls, swelling louder with each repetition, until the word itself became a weapon. Reporters abandoned their scribbles, cameras panned wildly to capture the eruption, and even the security guards shifted uneasily, unsure whether they were protecting order or witnessing history tear through its own restraints. The chant didn't just belong to the people in the room, it was carried across airwaves, echoed by millions watching live, shaking screens in living rooms, bars, and phones across America. For the first time, Trump looked cornered. His usual smirk faltered, the bravado drained from his posture, his eyes darting between Jasmine and the roaring crowd. The man who once commanded arenas now sat hunched, diminished, the chance ricocheting back at him like a judgment he could no longer escape. His hand twitched against the microphone, but he didn't dare lean forward. Every camera was waiting, every face locked on his hesitation. The predator looked like prey. Jasmine rose from her seat, her presence cutting through the chant until the room fell gradually into silence. She didn't shout, she didn't need to. Her voice was iron-wrapped. The chamber had reached a fever pitch, chants still echoing in fragments, when Jasmine moved slowly toward the Constitution's display. The crowd hushed, as though some unspoken reverence pulled every voice into silence. She lifted her hand and pressed it against the glass, the ancient parchment glowing faintly beneath the lights, a reminder of promises older than every man in the room. The gesture wasn't theatrical, it was solemn, as if she were taking an oath all over again. This time not just to the House, but to the nation holding its breath. Her voice broke the stillness, low at first, then rising with conviction. We don't need a king in any color. The words cut through the chamber, sharp as a blade. We need justice, without color. A collective gasp shivered through the audience. Simple words, but their weight was undeniable. Veterans straightened in their seats, survivors of January 6th bowed their heads, mothers clasped photographs tighter, and the cameras zoomed in on faces etched with awe. For the first time all night, the fury that had dominated gave way to something else. Hope. Trump sat frozen, pale beneath the unforgiving lights. His smirk had evaporated, his fists unclenched, his eyes darting toward the Constitution as though it mocked him. Jasmine turned her gaze on him, but her words were not for him anymore. They were for the millions watching. Democracy doesn't wear a crown, it doesn't belong to one man. It belongs to the people, those who fight for it, bleed for it, and demand it never be sold to the highest bidder. The chamber erupted not with boos or jeers this time, but with applause that rattled the rafters. Veterans rose to their feet. In salute, officers stood at attention despite the ache in their bodies, and ordinary citizens in the gallery shouted through tears. Jasmine raised her hand, silencing them gently, her expression fierce but tender, eyes shimmering under the lights. "This parchment is fragile," she said, tapping the glass. "But what it represents is unbreakable if we choose to defend it. Tonight, the question is not whether Donald Trump failed this country. That answer is already written in scars, in coffins, in the chaos he unleashed. The real question is whether we will fail this country, whether we will let fear and cruelty decide our future." The silence that followed was thick, not empty but full, each person in the chamber and each viewer at home forced into reflection. It was no longer just about Trump or about Jasmine, it was about them. The audience could no longer contain itself. Applause thundered, chants shook the walls, "Justice, justice." But then, like a tide, a new cry surged forward, spreading faster than any gavel could silence. "No one above the law, no one above the law." Within minutes, the chant had left the chamber, echoing across social feeds, stamped into trending columns around the world. Hashtags ignited globally. Hashtag "No one above the law" surged to the top, millions of voices joining the chorus from living rooms, streets, and city squares. The chamber was no longer just a room, it was the epicenter of a global reckoning. Jasmine raised her hand, and the roar dimmed into an expectant hush. Her voice softened, trembling with emotion, but anchored in strength. "Justice isn't about enemies defeated," she said, her words rolling slow, deliberate, carrying the weight of something eternal. "It's about lives defended." She turned toward Mrs. Rivera, toward Officer Adams, toward the workers who stood behind her. "It's about every life that believed in a promise and every life that deserves to see that promise kept." Her tone pierced deeper than anger. It reached into empathy, into the marrow of what it meant to fight not out of hate, but out of love for something greater than oneself. The cameras zoomed in on her face, the Constitution glowing faintly behind her, the chamber silent but alive, with the heartbeat of millions watching. And then the narrator's voice, heavy and unrelenting, slid into the moment like a challenge to every soul on the other side of the screen. "Whose life would you defend in the name of justice, and will history remember you as a bystander or as a protector?" The gavel struck for the final time, but the sound was drowned out by the swell of voices still chanting beyond the chamber doors. Jasmine gathered her papers slowly, her movement steady, deliberate, the weight of the night etched into her posture. She did not pause for Trump's glare, nor for the cameras still hunting for weakness. Instead, she turned and walked down the aisle, the Constitution glowing faintly behind her like a torch carried into the dark. As she exited into the marble corridor, the crowd surged forward, not lobbyists or power brokers, but veterans with weathered hands, nurses still in scrubs, janitors with tired eyes, workers who had slipped in at dawn to bear witness. Jasmine shook each hand firmly, no hesitation, her eyes locking with theirs. A veteran's voice cracked as he said, "You spoke for us." A nurse whispered, "Don't stop fighting." A janitor, holding a mop like a banner, simply nodded, but his silence carried the weight of gratitude words could not hold. The cameras caught it all, not staged,